I'm a little bit grumpy, and I'm a little bit grumpy about dyslexia and what we don't know about it in schools. My name's Bill Hansberry and I'm a specialist dyslexia teacher, so I spend a lot of my time working with youngsters who are having awful trouble cracking the code of reading. Now, just more recently than this, I found myself in front of a lot of teachers talking about dyslexia and what you can do about it. And when you find yourself in this space, you're also talking about the evidence-based teaching of reading and spelling. In other words, what the science tells us that works. Dyslexia is hugely misunderstood. We now know it's real. We've got fMRI studies to show that there are structural differences in how the reading job gets shared around a dyslexic brain when compared with a non-dyslexic brain. We also know that dyslexia is not a visual problem, despite the plethora of programs that claim that fixing some visual issues will fix dyslexia. So what is it? Well, fundamentally, dyslexia is a language-based disorder. It's a problem that people have with getting to the sounds in words, to use Sally Shaywitz's term. So, what do I mean getting to the sounds in words? Well, a non-dyslexic brain doesn't have much trouble taking a word like dog and mucking around with it in the ways I'm going to explain. So if we replace the sound d with the sound h, we end up with hog. So if we take out the sound o and replace it with e, we have heg. If we chop the g sound off the end, we end up with he or he, depending on whether you know something about open syllables. But of course, all this sound play doesn't happen with us being able to see the word, just like we saw the word dog in front of us then. It's the manipulating of the sounds that we ask youngsters to do inside their heads without actually seeing the word. Now, all this kind of sound play is the stuff of phonological awareness. And what we know about the dyslexic population is that is really hard for them to do. All of the experts agree this phonological disorder is almost always in the picture with dyslexia. And by the way, the ability to muck around with sounds in words like the way we just have happens to be the best predictor of whether a youngster will experience success or failure with reading later on at school. So it's a good thing that the National Phonics Check is coming in Australia. So what's a good dyslexia intervention look like? Well, number one, it goes to work on this stuff of phonological awareness, being able to recognise, discriminate, segment and play with sounds in words. Because pretty soon when we take kids to school, we start matching letters to sounds. So it's no wonder that when a little one starts school, if they have trouble with the stuff of sound play in words, they're going to have awful trouble when it comes to linking graphemes or letters to these sounds. We call this the alphabetic principle, and all young readers have to master it. Anything that doesn't go to work on this stuff of sounds and letters is simply rubbish. It's not supported by the science, and using it is reckless because it wastes kids' precious time. So if you wanted to make your bicep bigger, would you go to work on doing squats? No, of course you wouldn't, because it's a completely different part of the body. It would be madness. So why would you go to work on something other than the stuff of sounds and letters if you're having trouble with them at school? Now, another problem is that schools are typically not great consumers. They don't make great decisions about which programs to buy because they have a bit of trouble sorting out which is the stuff with the evidence base and what's the rubbish. I remember being in schools, and I remember myself as a teacher and a school leader being very vulnerable to bright, shiny, well-marketed programs that sucked, didn't have an evidence base. Now, before you go crook at teachers or your school's principal about them purchasing these types of programs, you need to know something about their teacher education. First of all, there's a very, very big chance that they were not taught about the teaching of reading, and they were particularly not taught what to do when youngsters have issues like dyslexia. Here's the other problem. Unless your child's teacher or principal went on to do a master's degree or a PhD, they probably don't know what good research looks like. They wouldn't know a properly controlled, randomised, peer-reviewed, bit of research when compared to the anecdote dressed up as evidence garbage that many of these bright, shiny, well-marketed programs are based on. Now here's something else we forget about dyslexia, or perhaps never knew. Dyslexic youngsters will forget. That's part of the condition. They forget these letter sound links, and it is our job to reteach and reteach through drill and repetition. Oh, there we go, drill and repetition, two terms that were seen as unpopular and uncool in education. But you see, drill and repetition promote mastery. But back I go. Don't be fooled by the kids when they forget. Keep calm and reteach. Don't go throwing good programs out just because you're not seeing miraculous results straight away. Work to a structure and assess the right things using a good response to intervention method. Another furphy that blows my mind and makes me really cranky. I often hear principals talk about how they no longer use withdrawal programs for children, they do the intervention in the classroom. What garbage! What utter garbage. If you were a youngster with dyslexia, how would you feel about doing a letter or a reading or a spelling drill in earshot of other kids, in earshot of your non-dyslexic peers? Kids will tolerate being withdrawn from the classroom as long as they feel they're making progress when they're being withdrawn. Now, if they think that nothing's happening, that the program's not working, and the teacher doesn't know what they're doing, of course they're going to arc up about the withdrawal because they don't feel like they're moving forward. Let's talk about multisensory learning for a moment. So, remember the last time you were at the ATM and you went to put in your PIN and you couldn't remember the order of the numbers, so your finger hovered over the keypad and you kind of remembered where your finger goes, and all of a sudden you got the right code. Or the last time you went to spell the word does, and you wrote it on the paper and it just didn't look right. So then you just said to yourself, DOES, because at one point you'd learned the order of the letters, and you spelled it right. So what was happening here? Well, what was going on was one memory system was stepping in for another when there was a failure, a problem with remembering. This is what multisensory learning is all about. Multi means more than one, and sensory means sense. When we teach dyslexic kids in an effective program, we use multisensory teaching, where we teach to VAK, visual, auditory and kinesthetic memories. Did you know you had different types of memories? Well, you do. You have memories for how things look, you have a memory for how things sound, and you have a memory for how things feel. This is why you can shut your eyes, not look, and probably write your name reasonably legibly. So, good reading and spelling intervention programs, and good reading and spelling programs for whole classes for that matter, have a multisensory element. They plug into this methodology. We have kids saying it, reading it, writing it, or aloud, so they can plug the learning into these three VAK systems. And when one falls over, and by the way with dyslexia it's often the auditory memory that falls over, one of the others can come in and save the day. Now, this helps letter sound correspondences stick in memory through repetition and mastery, return and learn, and practice, 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 because practice makes permanent. We don't say practice makes perfect, we say practice makes permanent, and practice also makes speedy. And this is what we want for our kids. Speedy recognition and recall of letter sound associations. Now you know what automaticity is, don't you? Well, if you don't, I'll explain it to you. When you get into a car and decide to pull from the side of the road into traffic, you do a lot of stuff to get that car moving. You put on your seatbelt, you press the clutch in, you turn the ignition, you check your mirrors, you put the car in gear, you check your mirrors again for traffic, and then you pull out into the traffic. And you do this, and you don't even think about it. You're probably thinking about what you're going to get at the shops and what you need for dinner. Now, of course, for all readers, automaticity is the end game, but for youngsters with dyslexia, it's going to take a lot more practice to get to the level of automaticity that they need to be at. So how is it you can do all those complex tasks that make up the skill of pulling into traffic and at the same time following the road rules, and think about what you're going to get at the shops for dinner? Well, the answer is automaticity. What you've done is practice those skills thousands and thousands of times, quite literally thousands of times, and you've got them to the point where you can do them without even thinking about them. So what you've really done is made automatic memory, so you've freed up enough RAM in your brain, to use a computer analogy, to be able to think about the shops and what you're going to get for dinner. Now the point is that you don't consciously think about these sub-skills of pulling into traffic, they're just there. Now this is where we want our readers to be, not driving cars before they're 16 years old. So we'll dump the analogy of pulling into traffic for them and we'll replace it with the analogy of reading text. We want kids to be so automatic with the decoding work, that is, the matching letters to sounds, that they have enough RAM freed up to be able to think about what they're reading while they read it. We call this reading comprehension. And when we strike words like this, and by the way, this word is rhinotelexomania, which means compulsive nose picking, our letter sound links are so rapid, so overlearned, and so automatic that it shouldn't slow us down too much while we read it. And it shouldn't slow us down to the point that we have to use a whole heap of RAM to decode and then forget the meaning of the text that we're reading. Now, this is where the dyslexic brain needs a whole lot more work. A non-dyslexic brain might take somewhere between 10 and 30 repetitions of, say, a letter sound link to learn it. That's why some kids just seem to pick up reading almost without effort. Well, that's not the case for our dyslexic kids. For our dyslexic youngsters to get to a point where this letter sound stuff is so automatic, they'll probably have to practice something hundreds, maybe thousands of times to get it to the point of automaticity where the decoding just happens automatically. So this is why a focus that I see in schools on only comprehension and fluency drives me a bit batty, because without knowing what they're doing, a lot of schools are putting the cart before the horse. And poor old decoding, the stuff of converting graphemes into sounds, becomes the neglected stepchild of reading instruction, when in fact it is fundamental. So we might need to remind ourselves about the fundamentals of the English spelling system. Well, English sounds are coded into symbols called letters, and when you see them on the page or on the screen, the visual areas and the language areas of your brain do this complex dance that, by the way, they were never built to do, and you actually hear the sounds as they come together into words in your head. So decoding is actually the bedrock of comprehension. Comprehension, sure, is the end game, but it all starts with our ability to decode. Now, do not be told otherwise by anyone. Do not be told that decoding is not important, and don't be told that you should be discouraging kids sounding out when they read, because this stuff is You just used a blending, by the way. And it is also, this stuff about decoding not being important is absolutely thumbing its nose at the research, and what we now know from the evidence is kids who don't decode are among our poorest readers. Now, by the way, these are non-words, and a non-word assessment should be part of every school's battery of assessing kids' reading, because this is the best way we can work out whether our youngsters can decode or not, because when they read these non-words, they can't guess them from context. They have to use decoding. Now, there's a frightening statistic in Australia. 25% of our Year 9s are at or below minimum reading standards. And if you have a look at the 2011 Pearls results, our Year 4s ranked this poorly when compared with other developed countries. Now, all of this is thanks to whole language, the 3 queuing system, and balanced literacy, all now utterly disproven, but for some reason a lot of us in Australia are hanging on to them. So let's summarise what makes an effective intervention for dyslexic kids. Well, number 1, it goes to work on letter-sound correspondences, the stuff we call the alphabetic principle. 2, a program that works follows a structure, and it builds up a set of skills very carefully in a cumulative way and only moves on when a child has got it. The program is patient. It's based on drill and repetition and overlearning, and it understands and accommodates for the fact that dyslexic kids will forget and forget and forget when it comes to letter sound correspondences. That's why these kids can read a word fluently on one page and then on the next page it's like they've never read it, or a reason that the same word can be spelt 4 different ways on the one page of writing. 4. These programs are multi-sensory. Like we said before, they plug into all 3 memory systems, visual, auditory and kinesthetic, and you'll see kids doing things like writing letters or groups of letters, graphemes, and as they write them they'll be saying the phoneme or the sounds that they represent. So they have kids seeing, writing, saying out loud, but they don't do any of this stuff before a teacher has directly taught them the skill, explicitly and directly shown them what the skill is. And on top of this, a good dyslexia program has components like spelling rules and morphology. Morphology is the stuff of taking root words or base words and adding prefixes and suffixes and how the words change in meaning as we do that. These programs will have an element of grammar and this thing called etymology, which is to do with the languages that words in English came out of. And when you understand a little bit about where words came from and what they were and what they stood for in the other languages that made up the English system, you kind of can make sense of why they're spelled so weirdly. Now, dyslexic kids are smart. Don't think any of this is beyond them, and by explaining this and working with etymology and morphology and things like that, the research shows us it will help them make the important memory links they need. And last of all, a good program or intervention is patient. It recognises that dyslexic kids will forget and forget and forget, so we will diligently return and learn, and we won't get uptight and we won't blame the kids for it. Those of us working in schools with struggling readers and dyslexic learners simply have to know our stuff. There's no way around it. As Louisa Moat says, teaching reading is rocket science. We've got to know what we're doing. So here's my plea to schools, and particularly the people in schools who make decisions about which types of programs they're going to use with their struggling readers. Before shelling out thousands of taxpayers' dollars on a new program, have a look at the evidence. Go and do a bit of a Google search. The MUSEC briefings are a great place to start. Ask yourself, does this program go directly to work on the stuff of phonological awareness and on links between sounds and letters? If the answer is no, you very likely have a dud on your hands. And invest in your staff's knowledge. Send them to good training on reading and how it happens. Now again, a bit like programs, there's good training and there's not such good training. So make sure it is a good one. If you invest in your staff's knowledge, they will help you make decisions between good programs and bad programs. But always remember, even a good program in the wrong hands, e.g. an untrained teacher, can be a very blunt instrument. So teacher knowledge is just so important. And last but not least, we've got to remember, when it comes to dyslexia and remediating dyslexic learners, there are no quick fixes. Right? So if the whole idea of cumulative, structured, sequential phonics with lots of practice and revision sounds unsexy to you, well, the bad news is it is the most effective thing we've got, and anything that claims to do the job with dyslexic learners any faster than that, i.e. overnight or in a number of weeks, it's not going to work. We have this weird English system which we have 44 sounds that we use when we talk, and we only have 26 letters to spell them with. So we have a complex issue already. And then with dyslexia, we understand it is a language-based problem. These youngsters have problems with phonological awareness, and often their memory lets them down. So we've got to be real about this stuff. Now, if you want to learn some more, I'm going to recommend some places to go. Have a look at the 5 from 5 website through the Centre for Independent Studies. Go and have a look at the Dyslexia SA website. Anything from the Spellphabet series of resources by Alison Clark are just absolutely wonderful. There's Outside the Square, Australia's first documentary on dyslexia. And last of all, if you want to scrape the bottom of the barrel, go and have a look at my website. Thanks for listening to my rant. And just as a quick credit, I'd love to say a big thank you to my firstborn Lawson who put this video together. You're a legend, mate.
Aye.